What's going on here? Katala A Push Nation. This is Mr. Majewski. I am here to try to film a very quick review video for Friday's exam. And of course, imperialism, populism, progressivism, and World War I. Now, I've already done the World War I notes as part of another video. I'm going to try to go ahead and attach them to this one at the end when I'm finished with all the rest of the notes. I also think that I went ahead and did a populism and progressivism video as well. But I'll probably go through the populism notes again just because I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay, so we're going to start right at the beginning. We got a ton of questions to get through, and I want to get through these as fast as possible. So, internationalism and imperialism. Okay, what was the form of imperialism associated with each president and be able to define each? All right, well, Roosevelt, it's big stick diplomacy. The big stick in Roosevelt's world is the military. You should have a strong modern military, especially a navy with which to use as a stick, as a weapon when you need to. Of course, you're not aggressive with it, right? But you always have it at the ready in order to enforce the policies that you want to use. For instance, in the Panama Canal Zone, remember, he sends gunboats down to protect the rebels in Panama so that they can sell us the land that allows us to build the canal. So you use your military to back up and support your foreign policy, and that important part is the military needs to be modern, it needs to be large, and it needs to be ready to act at all times. Next up is Taft, dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy is very simple. He thought that Roosevelt was too aggressive and that we were sending the military into too many places, and so, he says, let's use our other major weapon, our money. So, what dollar diplomacy said was, we're going to ask or encourage our businesses, U.S. businesses, to invest and set up businesses in overseas locations that our government considers strategically important to the United States. So, if we think Cuba is important to our interests, we're going to try to encourage our business people to set up new businesses there, to invest heavily in that country, so that the people there are provided jobs and opportunity by Americans so that they are more friendly to the United States and its government. In return for getting businesses to support our foreign policy, the government promised to protect those businesses. So if they set up in foreign countries, they don't have to worry about revolutions or people seizing control of their property because the government promises to use the military to protect those if necessary. Moral diplomacy, Woodrow Wilson was not a big supporter of imperialism, remember, and so he wanted a different modified version of it. He wanted it limited to kind of Latin America, and his version was that we should elect good moral men to run those governments in Latin America so that we didn't have to engage in imperialism any longer, and we didn't have to send our military in. So 3 different approaches to how the United States can have a larger role in international affairs. Obviously, Roosevelt gets more attention because it's generally more successful. And Taft and Wilson's are not as successful because, remember, the stated goal of both was to avoid using the military. Well, ultimately, both of them end up sending the military into various places just as much as Roosevelt had. So, therefore, not as successful as Roosevelt was. Speaking of that, what was the Roosevelt corollary and what were the long-term reasons and immediate causes of it? Alrighty, well, the Roosevelt corollary was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, of course, the Monroe Doctrine simply said, hey, Europe, you're not allowed to build any new colonies in the Western Hemisphere, nor are you allowed to expand the colonies that you have. We'll allow you to keep the colonies you have, but you just can't make them larger or expand them. The Roosevelt corollary built onto that. It strengthened the Monroe Doctrine. It made it stronger than it had been before. What the Roosevelt corollary basically said was, from this point forward, we're going to kind of police the Western Hemisphere ourselves. And if we think a Western Hemisphere country, a Latin American country, is in danger of being attacked or invaded or taken over by a European country for any reason, then we'll reserve the right to go into that Latin American country first. We'll seize control of the government. We'll pay off their debts. We'll run, manage, and operate that country on their behalf. And we'll stay there until we feel like they are back on their feet again and able to run their own affairs. What were the long-term reasons for that, and what was the immediate cause? Well, they're kind of the same, all right? So the reasons and the cause of this was that Europe was starting to become more involved in the Western Hemisphere again. Germany and Britain were loaning money to Latin American countries. Some of those countries were struggling to pay back those loans. Germany and Britain were threatening those Latin American countries. In some cases, with Germany, they were actually sinking ships. And so we were worried that this was going to turn into a full-fledged invasion. That would be a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. We wanted to try to prevent that from happening beforehand. And so the Roosevelt Corollary gave us that opportunity and gave the U.S. the ability or the power to prevent that. Obviously, the effects of it, Latin America really turns against us, alrighty, because we're going to use this to essentially intervene or invade in Latin American countries over the next 20 to 30 years. Every time they pretty much did something we didn't care for, or they chose not to support U.S. policy. How is it enforced afterwards? I don't even know what I mean with that question, all right? So I'm just going to kind of move on, all right, and go to the next question. What was the open door policy? Hey, this was another attempt, first by President McKinley, and then later by Roosevelt and Taft, to open the door to open China to American trade. China, as you remember, had been divided up into spheres of influence, into zones by Europe and Japan. We wanted that eliminated so that we could sell our products anywhere in China. Of course, we believe in the superiority of our products and that the Chinese people have a choice. They'll buy ours. The problem is Europe and Japan had already carved out what they wanted in China, and only their goods were available. So it was an attempt by us to try to force those countries to allow us to trade in China. We tried to send something called the Open Door Note. It was popular in the United States. It was not accepted by those European countries or Japan, and we weren't willing to push them at that time. And so ultimately, it's a little bit of a failure. All right. Now, I will say one of the effects of the open door policy is, if you remember, it does help lead to the Boxer Rebellion, right, where the Chinese people rise up against all of these outsiders. And if you remember, we actually joined with Europe and Japan, put an army together, put down the Boxer Rebellion, and then allowed those countries to maintain control over their spheres again. All right. We did it because we saw an opportunity to maybe open the door then, since we had been unable to previously. All right. Either way, it didn't really work for us. And so open door policy never is very successful. What are the long-term and immediate causes of and the major events during the Spanish-American War? Oh, man, long-term causes. Well, we've had a lot of historical conflict with Spain over Cuba. Cuba is viewed by many Americans as something that ought to be part of our country, right? The Spanish have been doing a terrible job, if you remember, of maintaining Cuba. Their policies had led to the death of hundreds of thousands of Cubans. There were massive revolts there. And Americans, of course, are paying attention. There are many Americans that are living in Cuba, and so this is a cause for concern. In addition to that, remember, we have yellow journalism that's occurring at this time, where the media is kind of trying to push us into conflicts or controversies in order to sell newspapers. The two famous publishers, Hearst and Pulitzer, are battling each other, and of course, Cuba is a major area where they help to spread American anger over what's happening there. In addition to that, remember, the U.S. is turning into an industrial power. We're turning into a population machine as well. A lot of Americans believe this is our time to act, that we must expand overseas in order to show our worth in regards to Europe, right, to show our strength. A lot of Americans believe we need overseas possessions because our population continues to grow. They're worried we've run out of land out west. What's going to happen when we run out of land with a huge population? A lot of folks worried there might be social revolts, rebellions, that sort of stuff, unrest, race riots. And so the whole goal here is to try to acquire overseas possessions to prevent that, all right? Businesses wanted overseas possessions because they wanted available workers. Missionaries wanted overseas possessions because they wanted targets to convert. So there's a lot of different factors at play that help cause us to want to become involved in Cuba and other places at this particular time. Now, the immediate cause of the war, remember, was the sinking of the Maine, the battleship USS Maine. Remember, the Maine was in Havana Harbor. It was sailing outside of Cuba in the port in the harbor, monitoring what was happening after the most recent Cuban rebellion against Spain. They were there to potentially protect or ferry Americans living in Cuba back to the United States if war broke out or got to be too bad. Instead, what happens, of course, is the Maine is sunk. Of course, the Americans, led by the yellow press, the yellow media, blamed Spain for that. Ultimately, because of outrage within the U.S., President McKinley has no choice. He must declare war. The events of the war, remember, even though the war started over what happened in Cuba, the first fighting actually took place in the Philippines. The U.S. fleet destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Then we landed troops to fight with Filipinos against the Spanish. Eventually, we occupied all of the Philippines. We did promise the Filipinos, remember, their independence. After that fighting had died down, the U.S. then focused on Cuba. We had Teddy Roosevelt land his Rough Riders there, along with other U.S. military forces. They're able to seize the island. Later on, remember, the Americans also snagged Puerto Rico right before the peace treaty is signed. So it's a wonderfully massive, wonderful little war for the United States. In fact, our Secretary of State called it the Splendid Little War, which is not a thing we normally use to describe conflicts and wars. Describe the results of the Treaty of Paris that ended the war. The Treaty of Paris, remember, the United States acquires the Philippines, which means that they become our possession, despite the fact we had promised the Filipinos they would have independence. We acquire Guam. We acquire Puerto Rico. We can't acquire Cuba, right, because we had promised the Cubans they would get independence when we declared war on Spain. Also, please remember, it wasn't part of the treaty, but we did, during the war, annex Hawaii as well. So most people consider that to be a gain of ours during the war, even if technically it was not part of the peace treaty. What effects did the Spanish-American War have in the Philippines? Well, it led to a rebellion there. Remember, the Filipinos originally fought with us against Spain. They were successful. We were successful, of course, because we could not keep Cuba. We annexed the Philippines instead. That leads the Filipinos to rise up now against us. They're led by a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo. They fight a 4-year rebellion against us. Ultimately, we capture Aguinaldo. When that happens, the rebellion eventually dies down. More Americans died in the Philippines than they did throughout the entire rest of the Spanish-American War. So this was actually the area that was bloodiest and was most costly for the United States. What were the Platt and Thayer amendments, and how did one lead to the other? The first is an amendment that essentially says we write it into our declaration of war. And what it says is we promise that we will not seize Cuba for ourselves when we win the war against Spain. We did this because we were worried when we declared war against Spain that the rest of the world, especially Europe, would not take our side, would view us as no better than the Spanish. We wanted to win the war of public opinion. We wanted to kind of look like the good guys, since that was one of the reasons why we had gotten involved in the first place. Because we signed that amendment, the United States was then forced to turn around and sign the other amendment. And that was actually written into the Cuban Constitution, and it was forced in there by the U.S. government. And what that amendment said, if you recall, that was the Platt Amendment, was that the American troops could land in Cuba anytime we wanted to. Americans would purchase a military base that we still own today there. That Cuba could not sign treaties with any other country without our permission. So even though they're technically independent, they're still very much, because of that amendment, dependent on us for decision-making and still under our control. So even when the United States kind of wanted to look good and avoid looking like the imperialists in Cuba, we still ended up kind of behind the scenes managing to control it as if it were our possession. What was gunboat diplomacy, and which president do we associate it with? We associate it with Roosevelt, all right? Gunboat diplomacy is what we use to describe what he did in Panama. Remember, in Panama, we wanted to buy land there to build a canal. The government of that land, which was technically Colombia, didn't want to sell it to us. So what we did was we encouraged a rebellion to occur there by Panamanian people living in the area. They rose up against the Colombian government, and then U.S. gunships moved in and protected them so that the rebellion was successful. So Roosevelt is the one who kind of engineered this entire thing. He was responsible for it taking place, and he gets a lot of the credit at first, but he does get a lot of criticism later because it is viewed as controversial, after he makes some controversial statements bragging about what he had just done. Who was Alfred Thayer Mann, and why was he important? Alfred Thayer Mann was a U.S. naval officer and an amateur historian. And he wrote a really famous history book that was really popular in the United States, talking about how important it was to have a strong navy. That a new, strong, modern navy was more important than ever before, and that was the key to being a world power. Why? Because you're going to have possessions around the world during this era of imperialism. And the only way you can acquire those possessions, and the only way that you can protect them, and get your forces to where they need to protect them, is if you have a strong navy that can act very quickly, that is dominant, that is modern, that can move very fast. Not only is it important to control and have a strong navy, he says also, hey, you should be building canals and other things that allow you to move from one location to another faster, so that you never have to worry about your possessions getting into the wrong hands. Obviously, I think you can figure out Mann's ideas are adopted by a lot of different countries, including the United States. We immediately start to build up our navy, so does the rest of the world, and then we immediately begin to try to make decisions like building the Panama Canal that will support Mann's theory and make our navy stronger. What was the Anti-Imperialist League and who were some of its most famous members? The Anti-Imperialist League is a group of famous folks that were opposed to imperialism. They were especially opposed to our annexation of the Philippines because it was viewed as undemocratic, unconstitutional, and these folks argued that it made us look no better than the Europeans who we were criticizing in Cuba and other places. Who were some of its most famous members? William Jennings Bryan, the famous politician, Democratic nominee for president, was a member. A number of leading artists, authors as well, during this era, including most of the folks that, like Hemingway, that we're going to get into. I shouldn't say Hemingway, but Fitzgerald, that we are going to get into in the 1920s. There were a number of labor leaders, if you remember, that supported this movement because they were worried that American workers would be harmed by all these new foreign workers that would be coming into the United States and essentially becoming American. Jane Addams was a famous member of the Anti-Imperialist League as well because, well, in general, she was a pacifist just like Bryan. Ultimately, these folks, by the way, remind me a little bit of the Transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau, who criticized the Mexican-American War in the mid-1800s. Ultimately, they were not successful in convincing the public to oppose the Treaty of Paris that ended the war. Instead, the treaty gets passed, despite these folks' objections and despite their efforts to try to raise public awareness against it. What was dollar diplomacy and where was it attempted by Taft? I've already explained what it was above. So where was it attempted? It was attempted mostly in Latin America by having us invest in certain Latin American countries that our government thought would be important to our military or strategic decisions. Ultimately, very unsuccessful because despite the fact our businesses begin to build businesses there and we start to invest our money in those things to build it up, ultimately troops are sent into those locations when there are problems anyways. In what places did the United States intervene the most during the imperialism period? Well, we intervened the most in Latin America, particularly the Dominican Republic. We intervened something like 20 times there over a 30 to 40 year stretch. A lot of the Caribbean islands especially. So Dominican Republic, Haiti are two locations. Latin American countries just in general, particularly in Central America and in the Caribbean Sea. Basically, the closer you were to the United States, the more likely it was that we would intervene. All right, so South America, a little bit less. Asia, a little bit less. But the Caribbean, which is right next to Florida. And, of course, Central America, which is right underneath us, and Mexico, are the areas that the U.S. really intervenes in quite a bit. How did the Jones Acts begin the process of reducing American imperialist control? Well, both of those are passed when Wilson takes over. Remember, Wilson was less of an imperialist than the other two. Publicly, he really ridiculed it. And what the Jones Acts did is they started the process of us beginning to get rid of some of our overseas possessions or to no longer consider them just colonies. So we have two Jones Acts. The first, if you remember, in 1916, right, it essentially set a timeline. I shouldn't say set a timeline. It basically said we were going to give Philippines their independence down the road. So when they are ready, we say, and we don't give a specific timetable, when their government is ready to take over, we say, we will agree to grant the Philippines their independence. It was supposed to be about 30 years, and that actually ends up being accurate. Right after World War II in 1945 is when we're finally going to allow the Filipinos to be independent and make decisions for themselves. The other Jones Act, if you remember, was designed to do something a little bit different, right? It was designed. The other Jones Act, if you recall, announces that we are going to grant Puerto Ricans citizenship. So we're going to allow we're going to make Puerto Rican citizens American citizens. All right. So again, both of those are setting a process where we're going back on our imperialist policies, or we're setting a timetable or a path towards eliminating them as hopefully colonies, and either granting them their freedom or incorporating them officially into the United States like everybody else. Describe American foreign policy efforts directed at Japan under TR. American foreign policy efforts were directed at Japan were generally a little like trying to make sure that Japan did not start problems with us. We would promise to respect their territorial possessions if they did the same to us in Asia. There's a lot of concern we might have conflict with Japan down the road because they are a growing power, and one that we feel we might bump up against in the Pacific. If you remember, Roosevelt negotiated an end to their Russo-Japanese War. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. However, later on, both sides ended up criticizing the peace agreement he had negotiated. We send the Great White Fleet, if you remember, over to Asia, officially on a peacekeeping mission, on spreading peace and support for one another and mutual goodwill. Of course, everybody knows when the U.S. paints those hulls of those ships white, in reality, we're trying to send a message to Japan: don't mess with our new powerful army, or else you will pay the price. You should also know a little bit about Hawaii. Remember, this is the era where the United States planters in Hawaii basically engineered a coup to overthrow the government. Then they seized control of the government and named one of their own, Sanford Dole, their first president. They wanted to be annexed by the United States so they would not have to pay tariffs to bring their goods into our country. We didn't annex them at first, remember, because the president, when this happened, Cleveland, was angry when he found out what these planters had done when they lied to him in order to get him to send troops. And however, later on during the Spanish-American War, the next president, McKinley, goes ahead and annexes them. We're moving over to the politics of the populist and progressive era. What were the origins of the progressive movement in the United States? Well, they were the populists. All right, so they were groups like the Grange. They were groups like the Farmers' Alliances, and they were groups like the Populists, the political party that formed before them. So those ideas that the progressives adopted actually had come from groups prior to that, and ultimately, since those groups had been unsuccessful, the progressives take on their ideas and end up having a great deal more success with them. What was the square deal that Roosevelt proposed, and how did he attempt to achieve it when he became president? Well, the square deal that Roosevelt proposed, remember, was where he was going to help all groups in society to achieve their share of wealth. All right, so what he talked about here was he was going to make it easier for all Americans, whether you're a businessman, whether you're a worker. President Roosevelt says, hey, my plan, my policy is going to benefit all Americans. It's essentially an announcement that he's going to pursue progressive policies now that he is president and he's been elected more so on his own. How did he attempt to achieve this? How did he attempt to achieve the square deal? His domestic policy, well, he does so, remember, by pursuing three things, right? They are the three C's. Corporate regulation, he wants to start busting up those trusts, right? To make these big businesses smaller so that that competition will be good for the rest of us. He wants consumer protection. Remember, he wants laws and policies put into place that are going to regulate products that consumers are using, right? We're going to focus more on safety We're going to focus more on making sure that our products are healthy and good for Americans. And finally, remember, conservation is his third C. He's going to focus on conserving our resources so that we don't use all of them during industrialization. We save some for future generations. And how did he achieve it? Well, he was able to pursue all three of those things in some way in order to get there. What four things caused the split in the Taft-TR relationship? Actually, there's only three. All right, so there's really only three things that split up this relationship. When TR steps down after his term as president, right, he handpicks Taft as his successor. So a lot of folks feel like their relationship is closer than ever. Roosevelt's going to influence Taft's decisions. That doesn't happen. Remember, Taft starts to get criticism from other progressives that he's not progressive enough like Roosevelt. He's stung by that criticism, and so he actually starts aligning or allying himself with the other side, with the conservatives in Congress. And so when the tariff bill comes into Congress, when Taft is president, the Payne-Aldrich tariff, Taft, who had campaigned and promised to lower it, actually ends up supporting the conservative tariff, which ended up raising it. Roosevelt feels like this is a lie, that he betrayed the fellow progressives when he made this decision, and so that's the first strike in their relationship. Second strike has to do with a fight in Taft's cabinet. One of Taft's appointees, the Secretary of the Interior, a guy whose last name is Ballinger, starts to sell off lands that were supposed to have been protected. He sells them to oil companies and others so that they can extract the resources from those lands. Another member of the cabinet that Roosevelt supported and was a big supporter of Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, criticized Ballinger for doing so. And you remember, Taft ends up firing Pinchot. So he fired Roosevelt's close friend. And that's a second strike. The third strike is minor, but it's nonetheless the third major split. Progressives wanted to get rid of the Speaker of the House because they thought that he was blocking progressive bills. And so they thought they had the votes to remove him. At the last moment, Taft stepped in and protected him, and so he couldn't be removed. So three different times, right, progressives argue, including Roosevelt, that Taft has supported the other side and has abandoned his supposed support for progressivism. And so, if you remember, Roosevelt decides to come back and run again for president as a member of the Bull Moose Party. So we have a split in the Republican Party between those who supported Taft and old guard conservative ways and those who jumped and joined with Roosevelt and his progressive policies. Ultimately, because they split the party, Wilson, the Democrat, is able to win the election of 1912. What was New Nationalism and what was New Freedom? These were the two policies that Roosevelt and Taft developed. I should say that Roosevelt and Wilson developed when they were campaigning for president in 1912. Both of them are very progressive, and so it's basically an acknowledgement by both of them that they're going to be very progressive if they are elected president. Now, Roosevelt already was progressive, but New Nationalism really is much more progressive than what he had done previously. New Freedom is Wilson's policy. He basically announced, I'm going to support small businesses. I want competition to come back. I want the little guys to be helped out by our government. And he also talks about supporting things like states' rights. Makes sense. He's a Democrat. He's also a Southerner, and so states' rights, obviously, was something that they considered especially important. How did each seek to expand the power of the federal government? Well, both of them thought that the president should kind of be the leader and spokesperson of the government. Remember, Roosevelt referred to it as a bully pulpit. Wilson did as well. He thought that the president should be dynamic and that he should really dominate the other two branches of government. Both of these guys, if you remember, would oftentimes go to the media in order to get the public to support their initiatives and to put pressure on Congress to pass what these presidents wanted. Both of them, again, want to use the power of the federal government in order to better regulate businesses and to protect progressive causes or to support progressive causes. So the government's going to get more involved in fixing problems in society, which is a very progressive idea and which conservatives argue the government should not be getting into. What was the critical factor in the final outcome of the election of 1912? And that, of course, is Wilson's victory. I already mentioned this, but the critical factor is that The Republican Party divides its votes, all right? They split them between two candidates. That's political suicide. You want to give the other side a better chance to win? Run two candidates that are going to take votes away from each other. That's what Taft and Roosevelt did, and so Wilson slides into the White House. What was the triple wall of privilege, according to Wilson, and how did he attack each part of it as a progressive president? All right, well, he argued there were three walls that were protecting all Americans from achieving prosperity. The first wall, remember, were trusts. So we need to get rid of those trusts, he said. The second wall, if you remember, were banks, treasury banks, that need to be overcome as well. And the third is the tariff. So all three of those, he says, are keeping regular working-class Americans from achieving the benefits that they should. And so he vows to tear down these three walls of privilege, as he called them, walls that protected the wealthy and or prevented others from achieving it. First, the tariff. He is able to get Congress to pass the Underwood tariff, which lowers the tariff rate. It also, if you remember, helps to establish our first income tax. Secondly, trust. We have two laws. One is the Clayton Antitrust Act, which made it easier for the government to be able to break up trusts that had gotten to be too large. It gave a big old list of all these reasons why a business could be broken up that did not exist before. It also protected labor, right? It protected labor organizations. It allowed them to peacefully form and to go on strike. And so not only is it something that's going to reduce the power of businesses, of trusts, it's also going to increase the power of labor unions. The other major trust wall, I should say, policy designed to tear down the trust wall, was the Federal Trade Commission Act. If you remember, the Federal Trade Commission regulated interstate industries like railroads, telephones, and telegraphs. It basically said, remember, if one of these companies is breaking the law or cheating its customers, they can file a complaint. The Federal Trade Commission will investigate, a new government agency will investigate, and they will issue cease and desist orders to any business that is found to be in violation of the Federal Trade Commission Act. And then finally, right, now we have the Underwood tariff to lower the tariff. We have the two different policies to reduce the power and influence of trusts as well. Finally, the Federal Reserve Act, which completely reforms and modifies, or I should say updates our banking system. We basically create a new banking system in this country. It's known as the Federal Reserve System. It's based in Washington, D.C. and New York. However, we have Federal Reserve banks spread out across the country in all 12 regions of the country. The idea here is to be able to move money, soft money, paper money, around the country faster, so that if there's a particular area or region of the country that is being hard hit by economic problems, we're going to pump as much paper money into that area. We're going to try to trigger inflation and other economic reactions in order to try to kickstart that economy before this problem area spreads into more parts of the United States. So the best way that I can describe it is almost like a shot of adrenaline. When we know an area is lagging economically or is struggling compared to the rest of the country, and we're worried that might spread to other places, we're going to try to pump as much money into that area to try to trigger inflation, which is almost like a shot of adrenaline in the arm. It's almost like taking, a Red Bull or a 5-hour energy into your economy to try to artificially kickstart it into going again. All right? So all three of those things are, and also, by the way, the Federal Reserve Act is supposed to reform banking to make it a little bit more fair and trustworthy so that regular working class Americans would agree to use it again. So that's the triple wall of privilege. That's how he's going to tear it down with his 4 ways. If you remember, the 4 ways are, our acronym is CUF, right? The Clayton Antitrust Act, the Underwood Tariff, the Fair Trade Commission Act, and the Federal Reserve Act/system. What was considered to be the most extreme of the radical labor groups inside the United States and why? The most radical group is, of course, the IWW, the International Workers of the World. They were the Communist Party in the United States. Who is their leader? I'm going to tell you right now, you don't need to know. His name was Big Bill Hayward, but that's never going to be asked in a question. The Wobblies, the IWW, they were by far the most extreme. They were the ones that were using violence sometimes. They were the ones that were encouraging strikes. And they were ones that actually were encouraging strikes, not to help workers, but to basically cause Americans to lose faith in their own economic system. If there was anybody else that was kind of that extreme, I would say anarchists, although they weren't really organized. They were just kind of part of other organizations like the IWW. Generally speaking, it was them. It was the communists. Socialists get blamed a lot during this time as well. Socialists generally weren't very radical or violent, but they were kind of lumped in with communists because both of them believed that the government should have more possession or control over the economy. So a lot of people, I think, confuse socialism with communism, and when communists were targeted for being very radical, sometimes socialists were caught up in it as well. What two consumer protection laws were created under the TR administration, partly over outcry brought on by the Jungles, by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle? Okay, so The Jungle is disgusting. It describes disgusting conditions that Americans are working in, and the food that's being prepared is just horribly prepared and a health hazard. So we get two laws. We get the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is going to require proper, correct labeling on all consumer products. So from this point forward, we're going to have labels. It's going to tell you what's in there. It's going to tell you potential safety hazards, so the public is more aware and informed. The other is the Meat Inspection Act. This was something that put federal inspectors, regulators in meat packing houses in order to regulate or inspect what's being produced and how it's being produced, so that the meat and other meat products Americans are consuming can be consumed without fear that it's going to get you sick or kill you. What were the major achievements in conservation for each of the progressive era presidents? Okay, I'm really just going to focus on Roosevelt and Taft. Roosevelt's a big one. Remember, he, along with Gifford Pinchot, is able to help get the Newlands Reclamation Act passed. While we do dam up a lot of rivers out west, we use that money to bring irrigation water to farmers. We also, remember, set aside millions of lands, well, I guess hundreds of thousands of acres of land. No, it is millions, for future use. So we basically identify millions of acres of land. We say we're not going to touch that. We're not going to develop it. We're not going to sell it off to companies or anybody else. We want to protect it for future use. In the meantime, we're going to use it for recreational and outdoor purposes. What caused the Panic of 1906? Oh, I'm sorry. He also, Taft, his biggest contribution was helping to create the Bureau of Mines. He also protected forest and water resources, just as Roosevelt had done previously. So both these guys are really good conservation presidents. They do a lot to try to protect forest land, specifically from miners who are interested in buying those and mining them for all the resources there. We also protect a lot of water resources in an effort to try to keep them clean and unpolluted. What caused the Panic of 1907, and what did it eventually lead to the passage of? Okay, well, the Panic of 1907 was caused by a number of different things, including a stock market collapse, all right? But the big thing here is a lot of folks blamed Roosevelt for it. They thought that his busting of trusts as president was partly responsible for the panic occurring because businesses had been so harmed by that trust busting. And so, one, it leads Roosevelt to continue to trust bust more than he ever had before because that criticism just kind of gets absorbed by him, and he's basically like, I'm just going to do more of what these people are criticizing me for because I disagree with them. In addition to that, down the road, it leads to the passage of the Federal Reserve System because the panic, which started out very small and only located in some portions of the country, spread over time to affect all of us in all regions. And there was a belief that had we had a better banking system that could react to these problems faster, then the panic might have never happened. So therefore, it leads to the passage of the Federal Reserve System when Wilson becomes president in 1914. Moving over to progressivism and reform issues, in what ways did African Americans encounter new struggles towards civil rights in the U.S. during the progressive era? Okay, well, we already know that African Americans were being denied the right to vote in many southern states, right? There are all these rules that are established by white Southerners. If they're not intimidating and scaring and using violence with groups like the KKK, what they were doing is passing laws that basically said, hey, you have to be able to read and write in order to vote. You got to pay money in order to vote. Your grandparents had to have been a citizen. That was called the grandfather clause in order for you to be able to vote. All of these rules that were designed to slowly eliminate African American voting rights. And as time goes by, African Americans vote less and less and less. And those who do show up on election day are targeted for violence, not only them, but their families. And so the message is clear. If you vote, bad things are going to come to you. We know all of that's been going on since after Reconstruction. So the 1870s, 80s, 90s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, those are going on. Specifically during the Progressive era, remember, lynching was a major issue, right? Lynching is the hanging of African Americans and white supporters from trees in order to send messages to other African Americans or white supporters to no longer support African American rights, civil rights. In addition to that, progressivism, remember, was kind of a somewhat racist movement. They generally agreed in certain things that, like, whites were more genetically superior. Remember, Roosevelt himself famously had dinner with Booker T. Washington in the White House, was criticized for it, and eventually stopped really getting involved in race relations. So progressivism, you would think, is bringing progress to society. At least that's what they argued, except African Americans, who generally speaking were not. How did W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington seek to achieve black equality in different ways? So Washington believes in accommodation. He believes that African Americans should accept segregation and allow whites to separate them from white society if African Americans could achieve education and jobs. So, hey, he'll accept being socially segregated. He'll accept his kids going to an all-black school if he and his children and the rest of black society receives education, receives job skills, and whites are willing to provide those. His attitude is that once African Americans have that, future generations are going to be able to use those to achieve social segregation and complete equality, and able to break down all of those Jim Crow segregation laws. So he's not a turncoat, he's not a sellout, he just basically is willing to accept some of the white policies. For that, W.E.B. Du Bois really ruthlessly criticizes Booker T. Washington, calls him a turncoat, a traitor, basically calls him an Uncle Tom, basically says, hey, you're working too closely with the whites, you're allowing them to separate and segregate us and treat us like second-class citizens. Du Bois argues that African Americans ought to be granted immediate equality, absolute equality, that they need political, social, and economic equality with whites. Anything less, he will refuse to accept. Basically says the top 10% of African American society, the most intelligent, the most skilled, the most gifted, ought to be granted equality right away. Everybody else should be granted as soon as possible. All right, so both of them believe in black equality, but they believe it can be achieved in vastly different ways. And for that, Du Bois oftentimes butted heads with Washington and kind of criticized him for his actions. What effect did dinner with Washington in the White House have on Roosevelt? We already know. He was so stung by criticism from white Southerners for doing this that he essentially abandoned race relations after that incident. He just thought it was too politically damaging to get involved in. What were muckrakers and what did they attempt to do? Muckrakers were investigative journalists, so they're newspaper folks, they're magazine writers, they're folks that would focus in on one topic for a long period of time in order to learn as much as they could about it. They would often do investigative work, almost like a private detective, where they would try to find files or information about a topic. They might dig through trash or other things looking for papers or records that they could then use to identify bad things or problems that were happening in society. So their goal is to cause the public to become aware of a problem or an issue in the United States that needed to be fixed. Why were they criticized for doing what they did? Well, remember, Roosevelt and others argued that these muckrakers went too far, that they destroyed people's reputations, that they dug up too much dirt, including dirt that had nothing to do with the issue that the muckraker was supposed to have been talking about. What role did social scientists like John Dewey have on the development of progressives? Well, remember, most progressives were educated. They were educated in colleges. They were first-time graduates of college, oftentimes in their families. Many of them were motivated by professors who encouraged them to go out and learn by doing, or go out and actually try to fix society. So new majors like psychology, like sociology, like economics, like political science, all of those are under one school in college. That school is known as social science. And those are the folks that want to use scientific methods to go out and try to help or fix problems affecting people. And so since a lot of these progressives had just gotten out of college, a lot of them had social science majors and were motivated then to get out into society and try to use those majors to actually fix problems. What issue did each of the following progressives focus on? Ida Tarbell, investigative journalist, focuses on big businesses, trusts, especially Standard Oil and John Rockefeller. Her own family's business, oil company, had been destroyed by Standard Oil. And so she wrote a series of really stinging exposés that portrayed Rockefeller for who he really was. The public was shocked when they found out the methods, tactics, and the personality that Rockefeller had. It caused folks to start to wonder if maybe these big businessmen were being idolized or respected when in fact they were responsible for a lot of negatives. Upton Sinclair, obviously, he's a socialist, so he wants the government to essentially take control over certain industries, but he's most well known, if you remember, for the jungle, which really led to consumer protection laws. So this is kind of an example of what he's known for as consumer protection with the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, even if that wasn't his original intention. Jacob Riis is a photojournalist. He's also a European immigrant. He uses his camera in order to document the lives that other immigrants were experiencing, not only in American cities, especially New York City. Really describes the overcrowding, the terrible living conditions, the pollution, right? The lack of sanitation and fresh water. Those are his focuses to really make the public aware of just how bad the conditions were in many inner city neighborhoods. Lincoln Steffens, Shame of the Cities. His book is about city corruption, so he really focuses on things like political machines. He focuses on things like corrupt mayors and governors, and that corruption was as bad at the city level as it was at the state or federal level. So that's really his emphasis, to try to get the people to become more focused on reforming their own city governments, particularly eliminating political machines. David Phillips is really, really well known for a book called The Treason of the State. His focus is on the Senate and how corrupt the Senate is. Remember, it's his books and magazine articles that finally inform us that almost every senator in the U.S. government was, in fact, being bought out and corrupt, usually by big business, especially railroads. And so as a result of his efforts, we're going to get that 17th Amendment, which is going to allow for the direct election of senators. David Phillips, African-American, focuses on the fact that African-Americans have really been ignored by progressives and that they are the group that progressives did the worst job. I should say Ray Stannard Baker did that. David Phillips was Treason of the State. Ray Stannard Baker was focused on African-American affairs, all right, and the lack of attention that progressives gave them. John Spargo, Bitter Cry of the Children, right? Child labor is his major area of focus. Jane Addams, settlement houses, so she's worried about immigrant women and children, the lack of housing, the lack of job skills, the lack of daycare and education for women. So she really kind of becomes the caretaker for inner city women as they try to survive and help their families to make it in these new American cities, especially slums. Remember, she helped to create settlement houses, which were essentially like massive, almost like apartment buildings that women and children could live in order to survive. Florence Kelley, also settlement house. However, she later on becomes a leader in the area of consumer protection and especially women's organizations. She would often organize things like boycotts for consumer protection purposes to try to get folks to agree to, businesses to agree to no longer use child labor or engage in unfair labor practices. So Adams and Kelley, originally settlement houses. Of course, both of them become so famous and popular that they start to focus on consumer protection. In Adams' case, she starts to focus on anti-war issues as well. Frank Norris, you don't need to know because, well, he's no longer on the AP exam, so we're going to eliminate him. We're going to come down to these last few questions. How did higher education improve as a result of progressive efforts? Well, this is pretty straightforward. Progressives were very educated, and so they encouraged education in cities and around this country. In addition to that, remember, they're going to help try to spread those social science programs that a lot of folks believed we could use scientific principles and procedures in order to try to improve human conditions. What was the social gospel movement? And give some samples. Social gospel organizations, social gospel, Protestant groups, usually women motivated by religion to go out and try to fix or improve problems in society. So many progressives were also social gospelites. Some famous organizations, Settlement Houses, Jane Addams and Hull House was social gospel. She was motivated primarily by religion. Salvation Army is another group that helps with feeding and providing basic healthcare needs for immigrant people, immigrant families, and the YMCA. All right, the YMCA, the YWCA, right? These gyms and other indoor and outdoor athletic facilities were created so that inner city kids oftentimes had the ability to play and or engage in sports or other activities that otherwise might be denied to them. What groups of Americans did progressives appeal to the most in the United States? They generally appealed to the middle class. They generally appealed to educated Americans. And they generally appealed to white Americans and more women than men. So again, women, educated Americans, right, middle class, or even usually middle class, and folks that were living in cities, all right, because a lot of their issues obviously had to do with cities as well, all right? Educated folks, I can't stress that enough. What was Coxey's Army and why did it happen? If you recall, this was technically part of the populism notes. Towards the end of the 1800s, a lot of Americans upset, especially after the Panic of 1893. And so some of those Americans actually marched on Washington, D.C., if you remember. They demanded that the government provide them with jobs and other training because they couldn't get hired and they were running out of money and they couldn't provide for their families. These folks believed the government would be pressured by these folks that marched to Washington, D.C., to do something to help them. Ultimately, instead, remember, Congress orders the police to go out there and to basically defeat the army and to force them to go home. Now, we call it the army, but that's a facetious name. They weren't actually an army. They were just a mob of angry Americans who were down on their luck, blamed the government, and wanted the government to do something about it. All right? So we should use the rabbit ears when we describe it as an army because that's not accurate. What were the decisions of the following court cases? Please remember the Supreme Court is very conservative during this era, and so they generally did not support progressive causes which they thought either interfered with business too much and or that the federal government didn't have the authority to pass these laws. Muller v. Oregon overturned a 10-hour workday for bakers. And then Adkins versus Children's Hospital overturned work hour and minimum wage laws for women nurses. So both of those cases basically denied the government's ability to be able to set minimum wages and or maximum work hours. Later on, the government is going to successfully be able to do that, but that's many years down the road. Schenck versus the United States was the freedom of speech case, if you remember. In that case, the government was imprisoning people during the war for anti-American statements. One of those guys was Schenck. He sued, basically arguing that he was being held illegally in violation of the Constitution. The government said, hey, you do not have absolute First Amendment freedom of speech. If your speech poses a clear and present danger, the government can, in fact, have you held in jail. And during war, like World War I, the government argued there was enough of a need that they could hold folks that were anti-war or anti-American. And the court backed them up. All right, that's most definitely a conservative decision where they're basically saying freedom of speech is not absolute. Northern Securities, American Tobacco, but those were both cases where businesses were broken up by the United States government. First, Northern Securities, that was a railroad company that was run by J.P. Morgan. American Tobacco was run by a famous family known as the Dukes. In this instance, even though the court was conservative, they allowed these breakups to take place. So these companies were, in fact, broken up by Roosevelt and then by Taft for being just too large and in violation of our antitrust laws. The insular cases, remember, the question was whether all of our new territory we had acquired during imperialism, would those people that lived there be citizens or not? What the insular cases said was that the Congress gets to decide each time we acquire a new location whether those folks will be citizens or not. So in Puerto Rico's case, they gave them citizenship. In some of the other places like Philippines or Guam, we did not. Who was the first woman to serve in the U.S. Congress? Her name was Jeanette Rankin. Remember, it's interesting because she was the first woman to serve, even though she technically represented her state at a time when women weren't allowed to vote nationally. Who was the people's lawyer, the first Jewish American lawyer? I'm going to tell you right now, you probably don't need to know this, but his name was Louis Brandeis. When Wilson appointed him, it was the first kind of non-Protestant that had ever been appointed to the court, and so it was considered a major turning point in the name of diversity, and a very progressive decision to make. How did the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire contribute to the first major child labor reforms? Remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, hundreds of young girls, women and young girls died. Many of them burned to death. Some died from smoke inhalation. Some threw themselves from the top stories because they did not want to burn to death. When the public saw these stories and pictures, they were horrified, they were outraged, they demanded something be done about businesses that use child labor. The Child Labor Reform Act was passed a short time later, however, the courts do overturn it. Now, during the New Deal and World War II, so about 20 years after the Child Labor Act was overturned, the government's able to get it permanently put. They're basically able to get child labor outlawed again. All right? What was the Wisconsin experiment and who led it? His name was Robert La Follette. He was a governor of Wisconsin. He was a hardcore progressive, and he basically turned his state into a progressive experiment where every progressive policy was tried out essentially at the same time to see what worked and what didn't. He becomes so popular with some of these progressive laws, like the direct election of senators, right? Like initiative referendum and recall, like going to the commission system to eliminate your political machines. That as a result, he becomes a senator, and then he leads progressive efforts at the federal level afterwards. What were other progressive states? California, under a guy named Hiram Johnson. New Jersey, under a dude named Woodrow Wilson, all right, who I think you know. And New York. All of those, the cities that had large populations and large cities, oftentimes were also very progressive. What were major political reforms instituted inside the United States during this era? My goodness, there are so many of them. Antitrust laws is one, right? We're going to try to reduce the power of political machines by using things like the commission system in many cities. Initiative, referendum, and recall, all are going to give more say to the people to vote on matters that are important to them. Direct election of senators, so the people are now going to be responsible for picking their senators, so that the senator has to vote on behalf of the people of the state they represent. That seems obvious to us today. It wasn't at that time. All right. Again, trust busting, where major trusts or businesses are broken into smaller ones, right, in the interest of the public and especially consumers. All of those would most definitely fit. We go to the secret ballot, also known as the Australian ballot during this era, so that political machines are unable to know how folks voted, to try to improve secrecy and honesty in elections moving forward. I think that's about it. I think I'll stop it there. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. Now, World War I is a part of a separate set of notes video, and so I will post that one immediately underneath this one in order for you to work on it. All right, folks, Mr. M, signing off. All right, hopefully